You're listening to The Greater Loop, a podcast from the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. In each episode, we bring to you leaders who connect Houston to the world, from business to diplomacy, innovation to impact. This is where global conversation begins. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to The Greater Loop, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by longtime journalist and Russian expert, Jill Dougherty. Jill spent nearly 30 years with CNN, including serving as Moscow bureau chief, covering Russia and all of the moments from then till now. Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Jill, you have spent so many years reporting on Moscow and covering Russia for CNN. From that long view and vantage point, how would you describe Russia's place in the world today compared to how it was when you first began reporting there?
Well, maybe I could even go back further because
Sure.
I actually was an exchange student in the old Soviet Union. And so, I studied Russian in high school and became an exchange student. So my first encounter with the Soviet Union was, believe it or not, in 1969. I was in college, I was an exchange student, and we were in Leningrad, which at that point, Leningrad, now it's called St. Petersburg. And that was, I can tell you, that was the big bad Soviet Union. It was felt almost in Leningrad, it almost felt like World War II had just ended. And, it was a pretty serious place. There was no information, obviously no internet, nothing like that. And people were so cut off from information. And then just physically, it was kind of, difficult. It was challenging. It's a cold city, even for Russia. The food was not particularly great. We often ran out of hot water in the dormitory. I think the only, I would say, interesting thing was, guess who was at Leningrad State University when I came back in the early 1970s? Vladimir Putin, who came from Leningrad, grew up there, and wanted to be a KGB officer. So he went to law school. And I actually talk about that in my book, and I'm sure, eventually we'll chat about that.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. And so would you say the difference between then and now, conversely, with what you think Russia is now?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's almost hard to imagine, let's take the good side. We know some of the bad side that's going on right now, but the good side is that the Soviet Union ended, USSR is over. People then were able to, start their own businesses, travel to the West. That was a big deal. And then eventually they were able to read their own literature, things that had been, forbidden. Life got better. And especially after when we get into the 90s, after 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy eventually gets better. People have better jobs. Life is easier. But I would say, if you say right now, and I say this with a lot of sadness, it feels kind of like the Soviet Union, because Putin is returning Russia to those days. It's not communism, but it is utter control of the society. It is putting people into prison. It is controlling what they can see and read and access on the web. And really, it's kind of like the bad old days again.
How do you think the Ukrainian conflict has changed Russia's relationship with the West?
Oh, it has transformed it. I was there. The last time I was in Russia was during that full-scale invasion in 2022. And I would have to say that just 4 years ago, I cannot go back, as most normal Americans would not want to go to Russia right now. But the war against Ukraine, and I say against Ukraine because that is exactly what it is with Vladimir Putin, has transformed relations with Europe, relations with the United States, and really had an enormous influence on the world. You just think of things like not only the fact that this is the biggest conflict in Europe, land war in Europe since World War II, huge number of sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. Putin essentially has turned his back on the West. Granted, he's involved in these so-called negotiations over ending the war in Ukraine, but I don't think he's really going forward with that. I don't think he really wants to end the war at this point. So I would say that of anything that I can remember, fall of the Berlin Wall, end of the Soviet Union, this is an enormous turning point. The only thing is we don't know what to call it.
Well, I have a question then. So as Russia strengthens ties with China and Iran, are they creating an emergence of a more durable kind of geopolitical bloc?
Well, things have changed because I would say the relationship with China is enduring. China is a huge country, much more powerful economically than Russia. Russia still has nuclear weapons, but China is building nuclear weapons. But when you get into the two other countries that Putin increased relations with after the full-scale invasion in 2022, namely, you said, Iran, and I would add North Korea. Both of those countries have participated with Russia in the war. And now look what's happening to Iran. I mean, we will see by the time I come out to Houston what is going on in the Middle East. But right now, Iran is on its back heel, and you have an extending conflict in the Middle East. So once again, we get back to the point that this is a huge change, I think, in the world. And Putin is not looking that great. I mean, let's go back. Maduro, in Venezuela, is removed from office by the United States. That was an ally, a friend of Vladimir Putin. Now you have Iran, and the Ayatollah is removed. I could name some other places where Putin's influence is waning. So the world is changing for him, too.
Maybe a little insider information about his character. Tell me, what do you think is going through his head right now?
Well, so Marianne, this is a very difficult question to jump into Vladimir Putin's head. But I would say what he is doing right now, this to me is classic Putin. So we don't know where the conflict in the Middle East is going. He's not quite sure what President Trump is going to do next. The world is changing, his relationship with Israel, with other countries in the world. So classic Putin is to stand back, maybe sit back, and watch this happen. Don't take any precipitous steps. I mean, he can let the media, the Russian state-controlled media, troll the United States and all of that. But basically, he sits back and watches. And he does not make any moves until he kind of has an idea that maybe he can make a move, and then he will make a move and then see what happens. So this to me is Putin. Some people, Marianne, think of him as this decisive leader, out there in the world, strutting around and doing things. I actually think he is a more, I'm not going to say passive, but more tentative actor in the world. He does not usually jump into things, except getting back to Ukraine. That was something that he jumped into, did not allow very many people, even in his own administration, to know what he was doing. And it has been an unmitigated disaster.
You've spent a lot of time with ordinary Russians over the years. What do you think they're feeling inside Russia?
Yeah, another complicated question because, Russia's a very big country and it's very difficult to say, what are they thinking? So as I look, there are actually some polls that are taken in Russia. Now, in the middle of a war and in a repressive regime, you're not exactly going to say, I don't like Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, if somebody called you, I don't think if you were Russian, you would say, no, I don't like him. So, but I would say, looking at the polls and looking at everything I read, people I talk to, even some of my students who have family back in Russia, I would say, just try to shorthand it here. You have, on one hand, you have the people who are, rah Putin supporters. They support him regardless. It's kind of my country, right or wrong, even if they don't like the war and the killing because it's having effects on Russians. They will say, well, he's the president. He probably knows better than I do. I'm just a humble citizen. Then you have over on the other side, you have people at this point who can't talk openly or protest at all, but they are over here. They do not like the war. They do not like Putin, and they want him to be removed from office or at least get out of office, and they want to stop the war. So they're there, and they're a slightly smaller percentage. So the estimates would be like, 18-20% maybe of Russians are rah-rah Putin, another 15, 18, somewhere. These are, nobody can pin it down exactly, but that percentage who say, we don't like the war, we don't like Putin. And then what does that leave? Like 60% probably of the country is in the middle. And in the middle means they feel they may not like the war. They may not like the fact that Russian men are dying. However, they don't feel that they can do anything. Politically or any other way, because if you go out on the streets of Moscow right now and try to protest, you will be arrested, and they may make your, the end of your career, end of your education, etc. So a lot of Russians are kind of in the middle, essentially keeping their heads down and saying, I don't know what I think about this. I don't want to think about it. I just want to concentrate on my own life. And I hope the president knows what he's doing, and they just kind of hide. And this is, I don't think they're very different from people around the world. Russians are kind of like everybody else in the world. They just want this to be over. But, sometimes, and the polling shows it, they want it to be over so that Russia gets the advantage. And I think that's where we have, a problem, because Ukrainians want the war to be over and to rescue their country.
And from the perspective of kind of global stability, what are the biggest risks in the current standoff between Russia and the West?
Well, I'd say there are two. The first one always has to be nuclear weapons. And I do not believe, this is my personal opinion, I do not believe that Vladimir Putin wants to blow up the world. He's a pretty smart guy, and he knows that really would be the end of everything. However, he uses the fact that he has nuclear weapons to scare the world, scare Europe, scare the United States, say that if you do, something that is not in line with what Russia wants, that it will be World War III. And you've heard President Trump use that same language. So it does, I think it's working. But in the end, I think he's using that just as an instrument, kind of almost like a geopolitical instrument. Now, the other point that I think is really important as well, not nuclear weapons, but what they call gray zone hybrid action. And that is already happening. So in Europe, as probably some of the members know, there is a lot of sabotage by Russia going on right now. There's interference in elections, sabotage, setting fire to shopping centers, for example, in Europe, flying MiG jets into the airspace of Estonia, flying drones into Poland, a lot of this. And this is very difficult because, it doesn't, and Putin does this deliberately, it doesn't go over the red line that would really require NATO to answer it with something. It just kind of tiptoes up to that line, and then NATO is left saying, well, was this an attack? Wasn't that an attack? Should we take action? Should we not take action? And Putin likes to use that, but it keeps Europe constantly on edge. And that's a very dangerous thing. And I think that's really what he's going to use more and more.
Do you see any realistic diplomatic pathways for entering a long-term period of geopolitical tension, seeing that kind of lessen a little bit?
I think it's very difficult. Putin has made it very clear, and he's actually used this word, that he is at war with the West. Now, it's not a shooting war, although you see, setting fires and assassinations, I didn't mention assassinations, are taking place. But this is not like an all-out kinetic war. That said, I think the danger here is, what does NATO, what does the West do to answer Vladimir Putin? And number one, I think you have to solve Ukraine. And that's very complicated. You can see, negotiations have been going on for a long time now, and they're nowhere at this point, or at least they haven't yielded. Let's say they've not yielded a result. So I think Europe has to be prepared, and the United States has to be prepared for action by Russia, and then also action by Russia and its friends. Now, Iran may not be able to directly do things for Russia. Iran itself is carrying out terrorist attacks as we speak. But I think, you have to think that Putin can marshal the efforts of his friends and buddies like North Korea, Kim Jong-un. Maybe Kim Jong-un, just to stir things up, might launch a missile. It's not a war, but it makes things very difficult for the West. And then China is a different actor. I think it is much more independent of Russia. It has its own foreign policy. But there too, China often tries to help Russia in undermining or making things difficult for the West. So it's a very, very complicated game. And it's not always overt, but it's pretty dangerous.
For American audiences trying to make sense of all these headlines, the Middle East, Ukraine, what developments in Russia should we be paying closer attention to?
Well, I think the number one would be, what is Russia, what is Putin going to do about Ukraine? I mean, the indications so far has been that Putin does not want this war to end. In a way, although he's losing so many people, it's mind-boggling how many Russians are dying in this war. But he has said he's willing to do more. He's willing to keep it going. So we have to look at Ukraine and see whether Putin eventually gets serious or not, and whether the United States, President Trump, can put pressure, real pressure on him. There is some. There's sanctions. The United States and its allies are going after those ships, the ships that are going around the world right now trying to sell Russian oil illegally, to crack down on those illegal sanctions-busting ships. But I think, until that core issue is solved, it's going to be very, very difficult. And then when that war in Ukraine is somehow stopped, I'm not going to say settled, because I think it will take a very long time, then you have to figure out, how do you keep some type of peace in Europe? What if Putin tries to do it again? What if he doesn't launch a war, but what if he tries to undermine other states in the region, up in the Baltics? Or, I don't think he would attack Poland at this point, but you never know. But what if he tries to do it again? Or what if he tries to stir up trouble in Latin America for us? So these are the very serious issues. It really is like a chess game, and it's never been more complicated, I think, because you have a lot of conflicts in different places and a lot of moving parts, and Putin is willing and intent on exploiting everything that he can.
Jill, thank you for sharing your insights. We look forward to hosting you here in Houston. Thank you, everyone who has joined us on the Greater Loop podcast. Please join us for future programs with other thoughtful voices like Jill's as we continue to explore global issues that shape our world. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much.